This is 7 Biblical Readings for a Post-October 7th World, a podcast mini-series brought to you by the Matan Women's Institute for Torah Studies. This entire series is dedicated in memory of the heroes our nation has lost in the past year and a half, and in prayer for the return of our remaining hostages. Welcome back to our special series, 7 Biblical Readings for a Post-October 7th World. Each week, one of the Jewish world's most erudite and wisdom-seeking Torah scholars is rereading an iconic biblical text in light of the changing Israeli, Jewish, and world realities since October a year and a half ago. These are ideas that they have felt changing within them in the past year and a half. While there has been unfathomable loss and atrocity, we will emerge from this. Post-traumatic growth will help take us to the next step of our national journey. Today's conversation about the Devorah narrative in the book of Judges is with Rabbanit Malke Bina, who founded Matan in 1988 and served as Chancellor for 33 years. She has now taken on the role of president, and she continues to guide Matan's growth and development. Rabbanit Bina is a visionary and has been widely recognized for her revolutionary work in advanced Torah learning for women. She has won numerous prestigious awards, including being decorated as a Yakir Yerushalayim, a worthy citizen of Jerusalem in 2021, as well as receiving 2 honorary doctorates from Yeshiva University and Ilan University. Rabbanit Malke Bina, it's an honor to have you here today.
It's wonderful to be here.
And I'm so happy that we're going to speak about a narrative that I think that you've been teaching about and speaking about for many, many decades, because even in the time that I've been in the Matan orbit, I feel like it's a model that I've heard you expound upon in all different ways. And so I'm really excited to have this conversation and hear how you feel this model has shifted, changing, is more impactful, perhaps more enlightening even in the times ahead of us. But before we dig deeper into the story of Devorah in the book of Judges, I just wanted to place us in this space for a moment. The story of Devorah comes in the 4th chapter of the book of Shoftim, in the book of Judges. And what's happened until now is that we've gotten a very clear sense that the people are stuck in a pattern. They're stuck in a pattern where there's no central leadership, which at least initially is presented as ideal, meaning that there wasn't supposed to be one central leader after Moshe, and perhaps also after Yoshua, after Joshua. And so they're in this pattern where they sort of have these ad hoc leaders that rise up and are able to lead the people locally, sometimes manage to really be impactful beyond their tribal area. And that they help them, they help fight their wars, most of them try and help them reform their ways, which are mostly idolatrous. But we're told each time anew that whatever amount of success there has been, whether it's 20 years or 40 years, that eventually the people revert to the ways that they were behaving before, and that the people in this period are stuck in a very bad cycle, which is something that we've also explored a little bit in our previous episode. And so when we meet Devorah, who seems to be an altogether different kind of figure, and who's going to be really moving and successful perhaps in ways that most of the other judges are not, we are coming into what is often looked at as the biggest threat from our Canaanite enemies at the time, and we meet Devorah herself. So with that brief introduction, I'd love for you to jump in to where this story really begins.
Okay, so first I would just begin with Devorah. I want to then backtrack a little bit about the background in the time period. But Devorah is, the first word that's used is Neviah, the prophetess, and none of the other judges are called that. Mm-hmm. Only Shmuel, which right away says that Devorah was an outstanding spiritual leader, prophetess, connected very strongly to God. She's also called Eshet Lapidot, which is a little bit ambiguous. What does it mean? Is that her husband? But we don't know who Lapidot is at all. Our sages interpret that this is the Lapidot, the wife of Lapidot, and that Lapidot is Barak. But it's a little bit questionable whether that they were actually married or they worked together. They definitely were a team, but Eshet Lapidot And Rashi brings a different interpretation of our sages, that she would make the wicks for the temple. Means the lapid is a torch, a fire, a woman of fire, a woman of flame, a woman of passion. I think is that Margaret Thatcher, who was called the Iron Woman. Mm-hmm. In that sense of also her spiritual passion or spiritual leadership for the Jewish people. We know about her, she Shoftat Yisrael, she actually judged the judicial leadership, and the people would come, v'yavo eleha lemishpat. She was chosen as a judge, not only a spiritual leader and a prophetess, but as a judge, that's a political leader. And we know from the story that she was also a military leader. But when I always would put the military as the fourth in her level of leadership. And now with October 7th and everything happened, I don't, I'm trying to put them more, I'm reading it more that they were all the same, that they were all interconnected. It wasn't that one was stronger, one was weaker, but they grew with one from the other and connected one to the other, and that her military leadership wasn't really less, and I'll have something interesting I'll bring in a few minutes, wasn't really less than her passionate spiritual and political and judicial leadership.
Right. What's interesting about Devorah is that before we meet the military context of the story, we have, as you said, a really unusual, pretty lengthy description of her, of all these titles she has.
Unique.
And they're unique. We don't have them by almost any other leader.
Right.
We have other judges in the book that receive this Spirit of God, this Ruach Hashem. But she is very clearly on a different level than those leaders. She has this prophecy, and what's also unique is that it seems that before she's chosen to be this local ad hoc leader like the other shoftim, which we translate as judges, but most of these leaders were not judges in the judiciary sense. But Devorah held that role, again, plain meaning of the verses, she held that judiciary role before she also received this sort of additional element of this story, which is more of this military role in and of itself. So there is something so much more diverse, broad, multilateral in her role.
I think also organic. About how everything worked. That in her judicial role, she would hear a lot about what was going on in the lives of the people, and also it's a sense of, first of all, we have to realize that she was a woman, and maybe the sense of the people accepting her was very important before she became the ad hoc judge chosen by God, that God wanted to see that this would be accepted and that her leadership was accepted, and that's clearly stated, Vayalu eleha b'nei Yisrael hamishpat. The Jewish people came up to her, seeking her advice and knowledge in judgment. And this is this we see in her life, and I think here she hears all the difficulties that the people are facing. We're talking about the northern part of Israel, right? The south is Judah, pretty much was able to drive out a lot of the Canaan. As you mentioned, Canaan is the strong force, the strong nation. It's called also Eretz Canaan, the land of Canaan. They were the stronger of the nations living in Israel. And the whole of the much of the first chapter where they weren't expelled from, right? They weren't expelled from the tribes in the north, and some of the tribes they remained and they were subdued and they paid some kind of a tax, but not in all of them. And there were uprisings of the Canaanites nation with a king, with 900 iron chariots that were very force. If we think about the atom bomb, or think about strong weaponry.
Yeah, they were the most developed at that time.
They were the most developed, and we also hear in the verses a much stronger language that Hashem surrendered them to the Canaanites. To Yavin was the king. He surrendered them. And they lachatz, they oppressed them bechoska, ruthlessly. So there was a life was unbearable.
Yeah.
Life also in the song, in the song of Devorah, she sings about that. We couldn't walk freely outside. The caravans stopped traveling. We couldn't be in the open cities. We had to be in the walled cities. We were afraid of what would happen, of our, our security. And she, Devorah, coming people, if they had a business, you couldn't bring your ware. What would happen? And I'm sure that in her interactions with the community, in her judgment, she's hearing more and more. And as a leader, she's going around inspiring the people, encouraging the people, giving them the word of God. Right? She's hearing all about all these difficulties they're having from Canaan. They're having from this nation that's ruthlessly oppressing them and subduing them, and they're not able to gain the upper hand. Not only the opposite, that they're totally subjugated and can't live normal lives for 20 years.
Also, in the classic biblical sense, they speak about Devorah without giving there's no explanation about how we're supposed to understand her identity as a woman. Meaning it doesn't say, and this was really unusual. Now, there are no other female judges in the book, and we'll meet another important...
even the male judges don't reach the levels that she's reached.
But in the classic biblical sense, it just sort of presents her, but without letting us know how are we supposed to understand her. And there really are interpretations that say that, the period of the judges was such a grassroots moment that even a woman could rise up.
Right.
And there's also much more sympathetic interpretations of the fact that, this was a woman who was very worthy of what she was doing, and not making big fanfare about her role as a woman is perhaps an advantage in this story.
That's how I see it.
And so I'm saying there's something, we meet her carrying the people through, and what you're describing is really one of what's considered to be one of the worst military threats of this time period. And
by
yet,
the strongest nation.
By the strongest nation, and we don't really know.
Right in your borders, not from outside.
Exactly. It's not another nation coming from the outside.
Right, as others were.
And we don't know exactly what we're supposed to do with it. And we start to hear also how the figures view themselves, but I'm sure we'll get to that. So we have our threat, and we have Devorah, who's a leader that the people themselves respected, and as you present it, she then accepts an additional role upon herself to be part of the military efforts.
Yeah. So she already from her spiritual leadership of the people, and hearing their all their difficulties, the judicial leader, she's the political leader of the time, and she realizes that this is what has to be done now, that this cannot go on anymore. This is the nation of Canaan has to be uprooted, right? And she says that she calls the military, the top. I don't know if he was the Ramatkal, the chief of staff of the army, but he was the prominent, the highest ranking military leader of the northern part of Israel. Barak ben Avinoam, Barak we'll call him, and she could, she knows she can't do it herself. I don't know, the level of her military prowess, but she understood that this had to be done, and strategy had to be devised to be able to defeat to Canaan, to be able to live lives as they were meant to do, as God wanted them to do in Israel. And God had told us in the Torah that you try to make peace with the enemies, but if the enemies aren't in agreement to the peace that you want to make with them, right, live together and pay a tax if it's the land of the Jews, pay a mas. But if those that aren't, and that not only aren't they paying the tax, but they're uprising and they're oppressing and they're not letting the Jews live normal lives, then they can't continue to be here. They're a threat. They're a threat to our existence.
Right, and she says specifically that God commanded her to do this.
Okay, so it's interesting, very interesting. God commanded. He commanded. I don't know if he says her.
Halo tziva Hashem Elokei Yisrael lechu mashachta behar tavo.
So she doesn't say oti.
Right.
Doesn't say
God has
Koamar Hashem el Devorah.
Right. Oh, interesting.
Or right. It's almost to him, and like I don't know if he received the prophecy. He may not have received the prophecy. And even there, it's interesting. Was this a specific prophecy that she received from God, telling her now is the time to destroy Canaan? Or Rashi has a really, I think it's a very offbeat interpretation here. He says it's from the Torah. It's the prophecy that Moshe received that we have to drive out the nations. We have to chase out the nations.
He's saying that she's applying Torah law right now, but she's but that makes her more of the initiator in the story.
That makes her more of the initiator.
Interesting.
Now, right? It's Rashi. And I always thought that was a little funny the way she's saying it, because she's telling him, don't you know that God commanded when who knows if God commanded Barak? And she feels now is the time. She knows that God has commanded it. God may have come to her and in some kind of a vision and, giving, showing her that Canaan has to be uprooted. But I don't know if in how specific, it's very, you don't know exactly what goes on in prophecy. I don't think I've not experienced, it's not something we're so familiar with, but somehow she knows that this is the will of God from the Torah through Moshe, and that now it's already gotten to the point of no return, that we can't continue this way, and in her wisdom realizes that she needs Barak to head the army, to head the forces that are going to be able to drive out and defeat Canaan, right? So she calls him. And he I don't think he received the prophecy. It means he does trust that she somehow is divinely inspired and knows, and whether it's as a neviah, whether it's as a shofetet, meaning the political judge, somehow the leader of the Jewish people now is telling him that this is the time to go. This is the time to go, and he understands. He understands that she's right, or he may think yes, no, but I think he understands that. He also sees as a military leader, even as a citizen, that the situation can't continue this way, and he says yes, we really should go. He agrees, but he would like her to come with him. Now, when reading it, I thought he wants her to come with him, more or less almost for moral support. As the passionate spiritual leader, as someone that people trust, that if she'll be there as the prophetess from God, maybe it'll be a time to ask God, almost like as the Kohen, the Aaron Rid goes, right? Yafutzu Oivecha.
There's something representational about her.
Right.
Something representational. She represents religious presence, whether it's in the guise of a woman or it's in the guise of an Aron Kodesh, of an ark, that she's there as a
woman,
as a symbol.
A spiritual woman.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah. And she tells him, okay, then it'll be as if you won't get the glory. It'll be that God gave it through a woman, but he understands that he needs her. He needs her to be there with him. Now, with so much that's happening, we'll talk a little bit later. What's been happening now and since October 7th with the women, but with so many women in such key positions, whether less so on the battlefield, but in intelligence and the lookout points, and so much that's being done by the women in the army.
Paramedics, doctors, right, and all those,
yeah. That I started thinking that maybe also Devorah's role was not only the spiritual and religious and giving the morale. That's also very important in fighting. The Rav that comes with the Gedud, the Rav that comes with the unit and the army, with the battalion. But I read something very, very interesting by one of the generals, also knowledgeable in Tanakh, Gershon HaKohen, that he seems, it's also, that it's a little bit more Devorah's initiative, with kind of God maybe prodding her along and giving her encouragement, but that, and also in the verse it says, Mashachti, you have to go and get the 10,000, whether, again, when this is her numbers, God's numbers, so, it doesn't matter really. Somehow, even if they're hers, they have God's kind of approval. And you that's your job, Barak. You have to, kind of, what do you call that? The Giyus Miluim. You have to do the...
Call up the recruits.
Right, call up the recruits, the reservists, or the soldiers on duty, right? You need 10,000 from the two tribes, from Naphtali and Zvulun, right? Those are the main ones that are being afflicted, with others joining as well, that we hear from the song. That's your job. And then she gives herself a job. Umashachti, and I will draw Sisera, right? The general that we haven't mentioned, that Yavin, the king of Canaan, is really leaning on and depending on, the tough man, the strong man, opposite Barak, because Yavin was more the king, but Sisera was the fighter, the general in chief. Mm-hmm. And I will get him to bring all his forces to Nahal Kishon, right? You'll be on the top of the mountain. You'll be on Har Tavar. Now, that could really be more...
maybe in prayer, she's going to guide him to get there, but you're saying maybe not just.
No, exactly, right. Exactly. Mm-hmm. Maybe not just, and maybe even the strategy of Har Tavar on the top, you being on the top, and they're being below, is also, that was... Gershon Cohen posits that could also possibly have been her idea, a woman's idea, which is an idea of being able to use like an intelligence and a psychology without not only the might of the army, but like how are we a smaller army, and that we don't have the 900, the chariots, that they have. How are we going to be able to
create an advantage, even though we don't have the physical advantage?
Exactly. How are we going to be able to create an advantage? And women are quite shrewd and intelligent and managing all kinds of things.
I would even say something more psychological about that, which is that when you are the half of the world who is objectively not the physically strong half, you find ways to make up for that lack of physical might. And that is probably a good tool in a moment of disadvantage. There's so much that's been written about. I don't necessarily agree with all of it at all. Just one example is Tikva Feimer-Kinensky's. She has a book on women in the Bible, and she has this piece there where she really opens the book and says that Israel, being sort of like the underdog nation throughout the centuries, leans very heavily, I would say, if it's true, utterly subconsciously, but leans heavily on a lot of these representations of women throughout the Bible. Women they fill all different roles, and they could have been prophetesses, and they could have been leaders, and they could have been queens. They could have also obviously fulfilled all the regular daily roles that women did and still do, but that there's this idea of being less powerful, but not... Wait, I'm going to say that right? That the Bible presents women as perhaps having less power, but not inferior. And her claim is that the people of Israel kind of created their image in the likeness of many of these women, meaning we knew what it felt like to be this smaller or less powerful, but not be inferior. And again, whether one agrees with that or not, I definitely don't think it was a conscious molding of identity. I don't agree with that claim, but I think that this plays right into what you're saying, meaning very often what can look like a disadvantage simply is training ground to develop a different kind of skill. It sounds like a silly example, and I'll say this as a woman in this stage of life. I have very limited hours in my day. I thankfully have many children. They come home relatively early. I have become a master of time management because I have to. right? If I don't manage my time well, then I could say I don't want to accomplish XYZ, but I still want to accomplish XYZ and have this wonderful family. So I have learned to become a master of time management. And it is actually a trope in many of the libraries in Israel that give a woman until 3 and she'll still finish her doctorate in 3.5 years. The other people out there, whether they're men or women, who don't have to finish, by that time, it'll take them longer because you hone in these skills based on the circumstances that your life awards you.
Right. No, and I think the point here is that it was on her mind. She didn't leave everything to Barak. She knew.
She's still calling the shots.
Yeah, she's calling the shots and developing a very astute, shrewd strategy for the war. That it could even be that Barak wants her there not only for the religious inspiration, but also to help along and make sure that the people will stay on top of the mountain till she gives the call, because that means they have to wait.
Yeah, meaning he's leaning into her authority in general, and that authority also helps in the military sense. That
they're going to have to wait, and on top of the mountain, who knows, it could have been, when we read everything, we think it might be in a day or two, but this could have happened over a few weeks. You have to call the reservists, you have to get everyone ready, you have to get the supplies, and they're waiting up there on the mountain, not knowing what's going to happen. Meanwhile, somehow she comes through on her promise. She brings. He starts moving. Veyagidu, and they told to Sisera, and he moves. He moves closer to Nahal Kishon, leaves the Charoshet Goyim, the city, to Nahal Kishon, the valley of Kishon that's closer to Devorah, and brings the all 900 iron chariots.
Yeah.
Now, this isn't in the Psukim. It may be, you can see it a little bit in the Song of Devorah. What Gershon Cohen says is that she waited for rain. That she waited for rain and waited for an opportune time. Right? Because all of a sudden she says, kum. Like they'd been waiting there, whether it's a few days, a few weeks, and now's the time to do it. Now's the time to do it.
Kum ki ze hayom asher natan Hashem et Sisera b'yadecha. Get up, for this is the day that that God will deliver Sisera into your hand. So maybe you're saying because it was a wet day and their chariots would slip. Right,
the chariots would slip and they would get caught.
Yeah.
And also they wouldn't be able to come up the mountains.
Yeah. Well, in fact, the word used is vayiham Hashem.
Right.
That God confuses or makes
panic,
balagan,
chaos,
makes panic. Exactly. It's a biblical word for military chaos.
Right.
That is seen as the hand of God.
Right. That somehow they're not able, but I think this was a lot of strategy of Devorah.
Yeah, fascinating.
Strategy along with the religious inspiration and that strong emunah, that strong belief in God, that this is what had to happen. God wants us to be in the land of Israel, wants us to take over. And if the enemies are willing, if the other nations are willing to live peacefully with us, but if not, we have to fight them and we have to defeat them.
What's coming through strongest in this reading is that while we often read these verses that says, oh, get up, for today's the day that God has delivered, Sisera into your hand, as we often look at it as she's just saying her prophecy. And I think that what you're saying is that maybe not, meaning she has a prophetic guidance, and she has a Torah worldview, but that her role might be much more militarily.
Am I being a little apicursit?
No, I don't. I think this is not at all. But I don't think at all. I think that the reading is that there's much more of a military hand here.
Right. Yeah. Along with the divine, I don't see her as any less spiritual.
Yeah, but totally.
Right, because we don't have words of Ko Amar Hashem. These are the exact words as we have in Yeshayahu or in other places, and it's in the Nevuah, which is not like the Torah Sinai. It's not word for word. She gets it, like an inspiration. This is the day, but also she looks and she sees the rain coming, and she sees, it's like a kind of a combination of God's hand behind the scenes, encouraging her, but her own strategy and her own thinking.
I think another important complementary idea to that is, there's obviously another important woman, non-Israelite, but another really important woman in the story, who is Yael. And what's really important, I think, about Yael's role is that we're told that Devorah has this prophetic inspiration, and we're told that whether it's exactly a prophecy or Devorah's intuition that has been honed by her spiritual connection, that this is the right time to do this. This is the right time to attack, the right time to pull back. That the wild card ends up being Yael, meaning not only does she become the surprising fulfillment of the prophecy said in the beginning of the chapter, that God will deliver in the hands of a woman, and we think it's going to be Devorah.
He says Sisra.
Right, it delivers Sisra in the hands, in the hands of a woman. We think it's going to be Devorah, but it ends up being Yael. Yeah. But I think
both of them.
It's both of them, but meaning on a technical level.
Yael would have never been able to do what she did. If they wouldn't have been all
definitely
running away.
True, but the surprising
and Sisra left his chariot to run away.
Yes, but the piece that I just wanted to highlight about Yael is that nothing about that is framed through a divine light. Meaning you have God. It says Vayiham Hashem, that he creates this, divine chaos in the war and helps that victory. And you have God who comes hand in hand with Devorah. But then we have Yael, who's also not part of the Israelites, who ends up being part of the salvation in this story.
Apparently she had a great love for the Jewish people.
She has an affinity. There are the verses about the alliances that the verses Dafka, they specifically say that she has an alliance with both, and therefore
she and her family. It's not only she.
Exactly, they have an alliance with both.
A prominent family of that.
Of the Canim, of the Canaanites.
Hever was a prominent.
But those verses let you know that she doesn't necessarily have a reason to favor one over the other, because they actually have an alliance with both, and
Sisra feels comfortable
with her. So it's just interesting because presenting her, she's not coming in prophetic or divine garb. And I think that it also is this incredibly important piece also on a theological level, which is that people in their daily decisions and behaviors can make decisions that can utterly change the course of any event that we're in. Meaning, I'm not saying that it's divorced from God, but they're not identified overtly with the divine. And people could make a decision. It could be a split-second decision. It could be something that's heroic. We know so many stories of heroism in the past year and a half. Again, there's been heroism throughout history, but much of it has come to the fore and been written about. And some of that is done imbued with a religious spirit or divine spirit, but other parts of it are another element of spirit. And I think that what's beautiful about the story is that it really leaves room for someone like Yael to come and say, this is what I'm doing because I think that this is right. And that there's the prophetess and there's the military leaders, and the prophetess who's also a military leader. And you also have this domestic figure, right? It doesn't matter if it's male or female. You have someone in that home front who's doing something that is heroic. And in the home front, there's this almost grotesque merging of the battle and the home front in that moment when she's killing him very violently. Curious what you think about that.
But I also think that it somehow Yael reminds me of Rachav.
Yeah.
Also
part
a woman,
of the
not Jewish, but who had I use the word love, affinity, who had a closeness, living amongst the Jewish people. Means many of they used to live in the tribe of Yehuda, but Hever and I guess some families moved up north, closer to the Naphtali, to Kedesh and Naphtali, and living amongst the Jewish people. It's a vayeshev et ha'am. They lived amongst the people, and apparently they lived and liked a lot of what was there. Also, not being Jewish, they could have this neutrality. So there was could be a neutrality, almost like a double agent or whatever. That they, you don't know where the loyalty lies. Mm-hmm. But it seems here that Yael's loyalty was with the Jewish people, and on the front she was able to use her prominence and her abilities. Of whatever she was able to do to Sisra and convince him, and persuasion and
there's a really significant, I don't know if it's conflating or inclusion of many female paradigms in this one story. Right, but Yael, the language itself, there's a question whether she's invoking a maternal vibe when Sisera comes in to cover him, give him a blanket, and give him milk. There was also language that suggested there is something subtly sexual about her inviting him into the tent. And how I always look at this story is that it's a very intentional ambiguity because her presence could have been both, and it could have been both for Sisera as well. And there's something, there are all these energies that are being invoked to do what she thinks is right in this moment. And so you have Yael sort of almost, Devorah is very conscious of her female identity. She says to Barak, if you bring me, then you're not going to get the credit. They'll just say that a woman did it, right? And she's very conscious of that. Yael doesn't have that consciousness about her. It's not at least what's reported in the story. And they're different kinds of tremendously important leadership. And they're both brought in the same story. And there's something fascinating about that.
Absolutely. And in the song, in Devorah's song at the end, so much credit is given to Yael.
Yeah.
She really, I think that it may have caught her unexpectedly. She definitely didn't count on that.
Yeah, she wasn't planning the attack.
Yeah, I think she probably thought that Barak would kill him in the end.
Yeah.
Right, and he was hunting him. Right, because all of them were killed, but Sisera wasn't, and he was still after the leader.
Right, and then he shows up. It's almost a little bit.
Somehow he gets to the tent also.
And he gets there, but it's almost comical because he shows up and it's like
ironical. They both get to the tent. Somehow.
Yeah, they both get there. It might have been an important meeting place. It might have been something that people knew
like
about.
Rachav. They say also about Rachav. That was like a
meeting point. And but there's definitely something about the men in the story. It's a very purposeful presentation of them being a step behind the women. And it's a very unusual dynamic. We don't have that in many stories in Tanakh. We have it a little bit also in the story of Shimshon, Samson's mother and father, where he's also presented as being a step behind.
All right, but they're not such major characters.
Not major characters at all. That's why it's fascinating that in this one story we have Barak, who is determined to, on a conscious level, to be connected with Devorah. And then we have Barak, who comes after Yael, who needed her. And he comes after Yael has already done the deed. And there's something just so fascinating about this story, again, because it's unusual that we have these two women who, rise to the occasion in a way that feels pretty effortless, at least in the way it's told.
Yeah, no, they're absolutely women of supernatural talents, and a special personality and leadership qualities, and also I think this sense of because a leader has to feel for the people. Like I don't think she was a military leader by training. I see her more as the Neviah and the Shofetet as always, but she felt that at this time, if she's going to be the judge meaning the political leader, her role now is to defeat the enemy.
Yeah,
she has to figure out a way that that Barak, that she'll be able to, with God's help, with God's inspiration, that they'll be able to uproot and destroy Yavin and Sisera and bring salvation to the Jewish people. And then takes, from there, realizes she has to think it out through. How will we be able to do this?
But I'm just curious, what about this narrative has shifted for you in the past year and a half? We mentioned in the beginning the prominence of Devorah in the military sphere, and how for you just seeing that reality on the ground is one that has brought you to understand, or the way that you perceive this story, which is that she really did have that military role, meaning we've seen that happen. It doesn't seem so outlandish. And is there something else for you that shifted about how you look at this narrative?
Look, I always put much more emphasis on her spiritual role and on her judicial role, and now looking at the narrative and seeing her not only as a military leader in name, but as a military leader in strategy, in reality, that this was a big shift for me. Also, in even it's very apparent in her song. In her song, where you see God's name is there, and thanks to God, many times. You see that this devoutness and this passion for God, for this woman of fire, a woman of light, a woman of bringing Torah, bringing justice and to the world, and bringing God to the people. But also seeing herself in the military role, and kum Devorah, and in her rebuking of the tribes who didn't come, taking that very seriously, this battle and this destruction of the Canaanites. And I think that there isn't much poetry at all in. I think this is the only one in Sefer Shoftim, or in the Nevi'im. You don't have. I think she really thought that this was that it was her duty and responsibility as both the spiritual and judicial political leader to also bring in the forces of her military shrewdness and strategy to be able to overcome Canaan, and that this might be the end here. We might be able, the end that we'll be able to live in peace, a happily ever after. Right now, when we have a happily ever after, it's time for poetry. It's time for exaltation, for thanks to God, for a little rebuke here and there, and discussion, and this about Yael, and description of the battles, but I don't know, 30 verses or somewhere, like a really of a higher level of poetry, of poetry to God, Psalms. Because she really felt that this was a time for jubilation, that she and Barak and the Jewish people, and of course with the help of God, the guidance of God all along, were able to overcome Canaan, and maybe they would now be able to build the Beit HaMikdash, or do whatever God wanted them to do in Israel. I think, I don't know if she thought there would be so many other chapters in the book of Shoftim, and so much difficulty. I think she saw this as like Shirat Hayam.
Yeah, the song at the sea. Right. There's the parallels between Devorah and Moshe are brought to light by a lot of our rabbinic commentaries. The idea that the comparing of these two songs. I think, but the comparing of because we said God is with us, God is helping us. We see. We're going to also come in the end. There is, the coming into Israel and building the temple, and right. You're saying when they crossed the Red Sea, they didn't think it was a beginning point of the next 40 years. They thought it was the end of the Exodus, and they're almost at the end point. So we're going to sing until we cross that boundary.
I think that Devorah also has a sense of great
success.
Great success with the help of God, of course. That God is with her, and this is what they had to do to the enemy. Like here, they had to drown Paro and the forces and the chariots, and here you also have the Rechav Barzel, and she I think it feels mission accomplished kind of thing that and with giving great praise to God. And I think maybe in a motherly way or womanly way, a little rebuke here and there, although men give rebuke as well, but it seems nice coming from her.
I think a piece that also really is significant here, that I'm thinking about more in the wake of the last year and a half, is the significance of the partnership between Barak and Devorah. Because I think that very often it's looked at as, why can't he just do this alone, right? Or why does he need her? And as you mentioned in the beginning of this conversation, the sages have a hard time in general with this male-female relationship, and therefore they tend to want to suggest that they're married. Although the narrative does not suggest that they're married, it doesn't fit with the plain sense of the verses, but they don't love this connection. But putting that aside, I think that what's so one of the points I take with me very much from this story in our modern times is the respect of their partnership. Because certainly in the battlefield or in these military contexts, and I would hope also even in the spiritual context, we're not looking for dominance of one over the other, but the partnership between Barak and Devorah, where there definitely is somebody who's calling the shots a little bit more than the other, and it's her and not him, but the relationship between them.
In fact, he wants it. He
wants
to
it.
Want it.
And the relationship between them, and again, also, it wasn't an overt partnership, but the Yael and Barak overlap in the story, to me is one that I would want to take with us, because nobody wants to be in competition with each other, and also we need all these male soldiers, and therefore I think the model of the partnership and everybody contributing what they have to offer in all of the circumstances is the one that we really want to go after. And obviously every community and every denomination will look at this differently based on their own internal organization and their accepted rules. But I think that, as opposed to looking at it, oh, here's a story where there's prominent women, I would really look at it and say, here's a story where there's partnership, and where one can be prominent because they have those skills, let them be prominent. And where the other doesn't, let them be led.
Lefargin. All the men of that period, Vayavo Eleha B'nai Yisrael, there were men and women. They really, they saw that, this was a unique, inspired woman with great talents of leadership, and they gave her the space and we're happy with the partnership. Okay, I just think maybe towards the end I'd like to say that nowadays, and as I was mentioning, that this caused me to look more carefully into what Devorah's position was and her military strategy. That also in October 7th. I read in the paper there was an article by Liat Kulik, who's a researcher in the School of Behavioral Science at Netanya Academic College, also professor emeritus from Bar Ilan. And she brings data from the Knesset Research and Information Center based on the first 3 months of the war, that about 18% of the reservists were women. Mm-hmm. Which is a 10% increase compared to Operation Protective Edge. About 10,000 women served in the reserves after previously being exempt, with more than 80% of them being under the age of 34. A particularly impressive close to 5,000 women in reserve duty were mothers, and 30% of them had 3 children. Just showing that, we're the information that we're given about Devorah's personal life is sketchy. We don't know, but it doesn't make a difference. If you have those skills and those talents, and Am Yisrael needs you, then so many of these women now, in October 7th, and throughout now the year and a half that we're at war, have risen to and met the call and gone there like Devorah. I think Devorah's leadership really was also something, and just the what was happening in the Jewish people and the need that women felt this urge, like we want to go. This is a time we want to give to our people. We want to help Am Yisrael to overcome the difficulty and the failures of October 7th. Here we have talents. We will muster our talents.
And not that there should be a next time, but there just in the past month was a massive group of, I know even specifically religious women who have now signed up to be reservists who themselves weren't in the army. So it's actually a different path, but they advertise it on
the Miluim without doing.
Yeah, well they do. It's called Shlav Bet. It's sort of another track.
Oh, Shlav Bet.
And they basically have enlisted themselves in reserve duty that's based on the professions that they work in. So please please God, we won't need them again, but I know that the numbers will increase in the future. And also many women who themselves didn't serve in the army. I'm speaking here specifically about religious women because it wasn't as socially accepted, let's say 20 years ago. Now things have shifted, and many of them feel that they really want to be in that space. And so I know that these numbers will continue to shift. We just wrap up our conversation for today, I think I really appreciate the fact that while, as I mentioned earlier, looking at Devorah as a halachic paradigm, or as a paradigm for religious spiritual leadership, is one that should continue to be utilized and put and is true. I think that this conversation today was really beautiful and almost necessary to look at the story again and say, wait, but this is a very big part of what she was doing, and we sort of tended to overlook it just because I think we saw a lot less of it in reality. And I think that the natural, again, for others may have read the story like this always, but the overlooking of Devorah's actual military role, I think that there's almost a little bit of a trick that our mind plays on us. I'll just bring an example that I have, like a pet genre of historical fiction, which are like untold stories about women that are then told in modern novels. Okay, it's a thing. I've read far too many books about female spies in World War II. But one of the points that always comes up, that always arises in these books, is that because women weren't expected to be in those roles, they were often able to be far more successful, let's say, than many of the male spies. They were the last to be suspected of fulfilling that role. And I think that that's a little bit of a mind trick that can sort of be played on us when, let's say, looking at the Devorah story. Meaning, because we didn't expect to see her in that role, we almost underplay how much that role was significant in the story. And so I'm so happy that we were sort of able to fill in the contours of that role of Devorah. So I really appreciate you being here and having this conversation with us today.
Thank you.